When European explorers first reached the Western Hemisphere, they encountered an interconnected landmass supporting roughly 40 million people. This aerial view shows Cahokia, located near modern-day Illinois. At its 12th century peak, 20,000 residents lived around this 30-meter-high mound. In the southwest, the Anasazi engineered stone dwellings like these at Mesa Verde, containing over 200 individual rooms built directly into the canyon's cliff faces. These ruins at Pueblo Bonito show the scale of the infrastructure required to support desert life. Long before European contact, these diverse environments were linked by formal trade routes and agricultural systems that spanned the continent. The first European arrivals collided with an established network of civilizations that had already mastered the North American geography over thousands of years. The rush to claim the North began when the other European powers saw the immense gold and silver wealth Spain was extracting from its southern colonies in Mexico and Peru. This 16th century map shows how maritime nations began racing to plot the coastlines and identify resource-rich territories they could claim for their own kings. While these nations shared an imperial goal, they used divergent playbooks to gain control of the interior. These conflicting methods would decide exactly where the new borders were drawn and which indigenous populations faced the most immediate pressure from the rising settlements. Spain treated the continent as a military obstacle to be crossed. They organized massive overland expeditions to search the interior for legendary cities of gold. Hernando de Soto's expedition ranged through the southeast as far as the Mississippi River, while Francisco Vázquez de Coronado marched from Mexico into the heart of the Great Plains. Coronado never found the treasure his men sought, but his party left behind several horses that escaped into the wild. Within a few generations, Plains Indians captured and bred these animals, using them to hunt across much larger territories and increase their range of activity across the grasslands. Spain also built permanent fortifications, like this city gate in St. Augustine, Florida. These outposts were designed to protect Spanish trade routes along the Gulf Stream from French interference. This strategy left a footprint of isolated defensive outposts and a legacy of altered indigenous cultures across the southern half of the continent. France initially ignored the interior landmass, focusing instead on finding a northwest passage that would allow their ships to sail directly to Asia. Explorers like Giovanni da Verrazzano and Jacques Cartier mapped the Atlantic coastline and the St. Lawrence River, looking for a break in the continent. This search failed to find an ocean passage, but revealed a path deep into the interior via river systems. France claimed the land by establishing a network of river-bound merchants, creating a trade-based empire that reached deep into the continent's heart with a relatively small number of people. England was a latecomer to colonization, initially focusing on the seasonal fishing grounds off Newfoundland that had been mapped by John Cabot. To secure their claims, England began shipping over entire communities of citizens to occupy the soil in permanent wooden towns. After early failures at Roanoke Island, the settlement at Jamestown in 1607 finally established a lasting English presence. This method of continuous demographic expansion proved the most disruptive for the existing inhabitants, as English towns slowly overwrote the maps of the eastern seaboard. By the 17th century, these three distinct strategies were playing out simultaneously across a continent already occupied by millions of people. While these three nations fought for control, a more lethal, unintended weapon was already at work: European disease. Smallpox ravaged entire communities from the time of initial contact, causing a precipitous decline in the native population that occurred much faster than the effects of colonial warfare. This collision of rival empires resulted in the collapse of existing indigenous power structures and a total reconfiguration of the North American map. We often picture the founding of the American colonies as a single coordinated project, a unified group of pioneers crossing the ocean with a shared vision of building a new nation. The reality is much messier. By the time the English arrived in the early 1600s, they were extreme latecomers. As this map of the Americas shows, massive, thriving Spanish colonies were already deeply entrenched across Mexico and South America, leaving the English to scratch out a presence on the rugged northern coast. The people making this journey were pushed out of Europe by compounding domestic crises. England's booming textile industry was demanding more wool, prompting landlords to fence off farmlands and evict peasants. Add to that the harsh political oppression under kings like Charles I, and thousands found themselves displaced with zero prospects at home. Making the 6 to 12-week Atlantic crossing meant cramming into small, overcrowded ships pitching violently on the open ocean. Many passengers died from disease or storms before ever catching a glimpse of the new land. This early migration was a desperate scramble. Disconnected, privately funded groups were throwing themselves across the Atlantic, each driven by entirely contradictory goals. In 1607, the Virginia Company established Jamestown. This was a purely commercial venture, staffed mostly by adventurers and townsmen, expecting to step off the boat and find gold lying on the ground. Sending unequipped treasure hunters into the wilderness predictably led to disaster. Without the skills to farm or manage supplies, the settlement descended into anarchy. Over the winter of 1609, disease and starvation ravaged the colony. Out of 300 original settlers, only 60 survived until spring. The colony was saved by agriculture. In 1612, a settler named John Rolfe managed to crossbreed imported tobacco seeds from the Caribbean with native plants. This new, sweeter strain of tobacco was a massive hit in Europe. The first shipment reached London in 1614, and within a decade, cultivating this crop became Virginia's primary engine of revenue. Jamestown survived through economic adaptation. Profit dictated the success of the Southern colonial model, establishing a pattern that prioritized cash crops over everything else. Further north, a completely different model emerged. In the 1620s and 30s, Puritans and separatists arrived seeking to build a strict city upon a hill, a place to practice their faith free from the Church of England. Unlike the single men looking for gold in Virginia, the Puritans migrated as entire families. Before they even stepped ashore, they drafted formal, self-governing agreements, like the Mayflower Compact, to bind their communities together. Once settled, they instituted a rigid theological orthodoxy. In Massachusetts, political power, including the right to vote for the governor, rested entirely with recognized members of the Puritan Church. That intense strictness immediately sparked internal rebellion. Dissenters like Roger Williams challenged the church's grip on the government and were quickly banished into the wilderness, forcing them to establish completely separate colonies like Rhode Island. Religious piety provided New England with the structure and discipline needed to survive the harsh winters, but its inherent intolerance drove the continuous geographical splintering of the region. Sandwiched between New England and the South were the Middle Colonies, places like New Netherland, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. These were hybrid models managed by wealthy proprietors or massive trading companies. The Dutch patrons, the Catholic Calvert family, and Quaker William Penn all faced the exact same economic bottleneck. The king had granted them massive tracts of land, but they had absolutely no manpower to clear the forests and generate wealth. They solved this by weaponizing religious tolerance. These proprietors used the promise of cheap, independent farms and the freedom of worship as marketing tools, successfully attracting a massive influx of displaced peasants from across Europe. In these hybrid colonies, religious freedom functioned as a necessary economic strategy to rapidly populate the wilderness and turn a profit. Despite their contradictory origins, all of these colonial blueprints shared a harsh reality. None of them could survive the physical environment without direct intervention from Native Americans. Local tribes provided the initial lifelines. They supplied the European newcomers with vital agricultural technology for growing native crops like maize, beans, and squash, and opened up access to the highly lucrative fur trade. This data map of the eastern seaboard shows how brief that cooperation was. The colonies required a relentless supply of timber, game, and acreage, resulting in a rapid, exponential expansion, pushing outward into established native territories. The result was a series of devastating skirmishes and wars. From the Virginia uprisings of 1622 to King Philip's War in New England 50 years later, native tribes were continuously killed or forced westward. Colonial survival relied entirely on a dark cycle, initial reliance on native knowledge, followed by aggressive and violent territorial conquest. The colony shared a second unifying crisis. Extracting timber, tobacco, and crops from their newly conquered land demanded a massive, sustained labor force they simply did not possess. Their initial stopgap was the indentured servant system. Promoters and ship captains brought over roughly half of the early colonists by trading their ocean passage for 4 to 7 years of bound contract labor. Early indenture documents illustrate exactly how deeply formalized the trading of human labor was in the colonial economy, with years of a person's life strictly codified and legally bound by contract. Then came a final permanent shift. The first enslaved Africans were brought to Virginia in 1619. As the insatiable demand for plantation labor grew, the legal system surrounding them hardened, cementing into involuntary lifetime servitude by the 1660s. The early American colonies sustained their fragmented origins by cementing a brutal, racially based system of forced labor that would shape the continent for centuries.